This podcast is brought to you by Sport Time featuring Spark. Check out sparkpe.org for all your equipment, training, and curriculum needs. Also, make sure you check out physpedagogy.com, where you can find a variety of professional development options, including blogs, webinars, and this podcast. That's physpedagogy.com. Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Global Phys Ed Voxcast. My name is Jorge Rodriguez, and I'm a physical education teacher from Houston, Texas, and the producer of the show. So this week's episode is a BlabberMouth 101 with Justin Schleider and Katie White. And they're going to be talking all about assessment. So it's my pleasure to bring you Justin Schleider's interview with Katie White.
You are a blabbermouth!
Ladies and gentlemen,
I do not say blah, blah, blah.
All right. Hello there. Welcome to another BlabberMouths 101 episode. This time we will be talking assessment with Katie White from Saskatchewan, Canada. So Katie, start us off with telling us a little bit about your background and what makes you knowledgeable about assessment.
Well, I'm a coordinator of learning for the Northeast School Division in Saskatchewan, which means that I spend a lot of time inside classrooms from grades 4 to 12. I also do some assessment work with Solution Tree in their assessment center. So I travel around the world and do presentations on assessment and talk with people about assessment practices.
All right. So that sounds good enough for me. So let's start at the beginning. What exactly is assessment? We hear it all the time. When we talk about assessing our students, what exactly is it? Can you describe it to us from the very beginning, pretending that we know nothing about assessment?
Sure. So if we're talking about assessment in a pretty wide open way, it's anytime we're trying to figure out the relationship between a desired outcome or a goal or something that we're hoping for and our current state of affairs. So I like to think of assessment as something that human beings do naturally every day. It's part of our decision-making process. It's part of how we function in the world. So if I'm walking down the street and I know that I need to step over a puddle to not get my shoes wet, after I've done that, I'm going to assess how successful that was. And it's just a really natural process for making sure that we can function in our world.
All right, so I understand why we need to assess what's around us. Now, why do we need to assess our students?
So in a school setting, what it means is that we're spending time with students comparing where they are in this moment with where we need them to be based on our standards and our targets.
Now, how do we do that? How do we figure out where they're at now? And how do we figure out where we want them to get to and how we want them to get to through assessments?
So probably the most important thing that we want to do in school is be really clear about the targets and goals themselves. And that's usually where we have to invest a fair amount of time. If you are working based on standards or learning goals or outcomes or whatever we call those desired goals for your students, you start with those and you figure out what those standards mean. So it could be anything from having kids learn how to send and receive or using long-handled implements, or it could be in science conducting an experiment and making hypotheses. It doesn't matter as long as we're really, really clear about what that's going to look and sound like when we see it. After that, what we do is we take a look at what students are doing in the moment. So we can capture them through video, or we can observe them, or we can mark their writing. There's all kinds of ways that we can capture artifacts of their learning, and then we lay that alongside those desired goals and figure out how close those learners are to where we need them to be.
So how important is it that we assess our students?
I think it's pretty tough to be a teacher without doing it. I think there's lots and lots of flexibility. We can have lots of discussion about what that assessment looks like, how high stakes it is for learners, which assessments we're going to record and which ones we're just going to keep track of so that we can plan our instruction. There's lots of interpretations of assessment, but it's really, really tough to be a good responsive teacher who offers targeted practice and little mini lessons that mean something to the learners without assessing where they are in this moment so that we can respond to their needs.
And I think in physical education, that's where we used to lose out, where we didn't have the baseline. We didn't know where they were now to figure out where they had to get to. We kind of just shot to the middle and then hoped that the lower would come along and somehow the highest would be challenged. And without any kind of data or knowledge or facts to prove it, we were just kind of shooting around in the dark. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, and when I think of myself early in my teaching career, I know that I spent a lot of time planning activities or events or things that I thought would be engaging for learners, exciting, and I kind of hoped that they would incidentally learn some of those things that were key. It's just like you were saying, Justin, you kind of just shoot out there and hope that kids grab onto what you're throwing at them. But the problem with that, and we know this, is that our kids who need enrichment are often left to practice things that they already know, and our learners who are struggling with certain concepts or building readiness in certain areas never get their needs met, so they can't actually fully participate in what we're sharing with them because they don't have the skills and knowledge they need to get there.
All right, so I do know in my schooling I've come across there are two main types of assessments from what I understand, formative and summative. Can you tell us the difference between those two? And are there any other types of assessments that are not talked about in education circles?
Well, I think formative and summative are the two key main big categories that we use to talk about assessment. And so in a general sense, and I mean, of course, everything is up to all kinds of interpretation, but in a general sense, something is formative. Our assessment is formative when we intend and actually do take action from it. So when we use an assessment to inform our instruction the next day, to figure out where we have to fill in gaps and help kids practice, or when we use formative assessment to offer good, targeted, structured feedback, then it's formative because we're taking action from that. Summative traditionally is thought of as something that is the end of a learning cycle, and we're really trying to verify degrees of proficiency. That being said, phys ed is a perfect example where something that we could intend to be summative could turn formative when children learn new skills, practice more, and continue to develop their proficiency. So the line isn't as black or white as we'd like to think, but that's the general difference between the two. Within formative, there's self-assessment, there's pre-assessment, there's long-term, more robust formatives. There's short, quick exit card time kinds of formatives or observations. So there's all kinds of ways that we can do formative assessment. But in general, you have to take action in order for it to be truly formative.
Beautiful. That is a definition that I can understand. And it's kind of funny because you were saying formative, and in my head I'm thinking informative. You're giving me information. Now I could do something with that information. And then either, go back, reteach my lesson, or use it in some way to shape future lessons, which you talked about with the pretest. So can you talk about some sort of the formative assessments that are the pre-assessments? What are we looking for, and how do teachers set them up?
So pre-assessments are a really interesting topic because there is some controversy with them. And I think the controversy with a pre-assessment lies in student response to pre-assessments. It's very understandable that if we don't explain to students the purpose of a pre-assessment, if we don't help them understand that when we do a pre-assessment, we're trying to inform our own practice and inform or ensure that they're going to get their needs met, then kids can do a pre-assessment and feel pretty discouraged by it. They might just, because kids tend to think of every assessment as an assessment that counts, you have to do some talking ahead of time around pre-assessment. There's all kinds of different pre-assessments that you can do. There's pre-assessments that measure end-of-unit skills so that you can see which prior skills and knowledge students possess before you start. Those kinds of assessments can be really robust, and they can actually look a lot like the summative assessment that you would give at the end. If you're going to do those kinds of assessments, they're really handy for helping you structure learning, any learning that follows. But again, you have to really help students understand that it's their job to do poorly on parts of that assessment so that you have teaching to do. It's part of your contract with them to figure out what they know and don't know. You can also do pre-assessments that are more diagnostic in nature, that measure precursor skills that students may have learned prior to coming to your class. Those kinds of pre-assessments tend to be more optimistic for kids because they tend to do better. They practice those skills over the years and that knowledge, and they can show you a little bit more. Each of those pre-assessments serves a different purpose, but they both can be really important for good planning. And then the last kind of pre-assessment can be a pre-assessment around attitude. So I've asked math students to write me a letter about their relationship with math, or you can ask physical education students to tell you about their experiences with sport before they've come to your class. That can help inform your understanding of their attitudes and their aptitudes for your subject area. So there's all kinds of ways you can do it.
What are the pre-assessments you saw that seemed to work the best?
Well, I think the best pre-assessments are pre-assessments that we're actually going to use. And so I think the critical thing for teachers is when they're making a decision to do a pre-assessment to have a look at their standards and their targets and ask themselves, what information would truly be most beneficial for me to know in this moment? If you're in a school where you've worked with children for a long time, you probably know a whole bunch about them. And so you might want to just pre-assess them on really specific skills and knowledge that are going to ready them for what's coming up. If you've never met the kids before, you might need to do a pre-assessment that's a little bit more robust. And I've seen both work. I've seen both be very powerful. That kind of pre-assessment that I described in the beginning, where it looks a lot like a summative assessment that you give at the beginning, I've seen work very powerfully in a senior math class, where students, we used to refer to that pre-assessment every day to frame our lessons. We would tell the learners to have a look at questions 2 and 3, that those are the kinds of questions we were going to try and answer today. By the end of the day, they'd be able to go back to their pre-assessment and give that another try and do well. So it really comes down to what you want to know and the kind of discourse that you have with students around that pre-assessment so they also understand the purpose.
All right, so let's get into some of the other formative assessments. When we're talking about our classic exit tickets, what are we looking for there, and what should teachers do after they've given the exit tickets and received them back?
Well, first of all, by nature of an exit ticket happening pretty quickly, I think you want to make sure that you're asking questions that students can answer in a fairly short period of time and that you can sort in a fairly short period of time, and probably questions that measure at most 1 or 2 different concepts that you're looking to check on. What teachers should do is they should take those exit tickets and they should probably sort them into 3 piles maybe. A pile of learners who have mastered the content and are obviously feeling comfortable with it. A pile of learners who need to build 1 or 2 different concepts, may have a few small misconceptions that need to just be shifted. And then you might have a pile of learners who you're a little bit more concerned about. They seem to miss some of those greater concepts. What you can then do is make a decision for the next day about how you might differentiate instruction. So those learners who have already mastered the content might, for the first 10 minutes of class, 5 or 10 minutes, work on something that's going to deepen or enrich their understanding, and then you might pull the learners who completely missed the boat over to a small group and do some really targeted teaching, and perhaps that middle of the road group might join your upper level group to just refine those skills, or they might have a group in and of themselves to develop it. It all depends on the kinds of questions you've asked. But I would say you don't want to sort it into more than 3 piles, or you're going to have a hard time responding the next day.
So you want the feedback should be immediate. Like as soon as they walk in, you're going to use what data you've gathered at the end of the previous class to begin instruction on the next class?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best use of it. And the other thing that's really cool about that is if you can explain that to the kids, then they start to see why formative assessment might be important to them. There's often a concern that if we don't attach a score to something, that kids won't take it seriously. As soon as you can show kids that they're going to receive good, solid, meaningful instruction and they won't have to repeat things they already know, then they start to buy into the idea of formative as making their learning lives a little bit better. So it's a win-win for both the teacher and the students.
All right, now what about in-class assessments? So let's say I'm 15 or 20 minutes in. What are some assessments that I can give, and how would I do it so that I can find out right in the class and pivot and either say, all right, we're ready to move on, or continue doing what we're doing? What would that look like?
Well, I think lots of teachers do things like that already. So if you have kids who are practicing problems in small groups or independently, that's a really good chance for you to go around with a clipboard or an iPad if you have one that works that way, and make notes of students who you think are approaching proficiency, where they're at. You can do formative assessments that are really kinesthetic, so you could assign 4 corners of the room to 4 different multiple choice answers and have your learners go to a corner and defend their answer, and it gives you a sense of the kinds of misconceptions that students might have, or things that they still need to work on. You could observe the learners, videotape them, play back the videotapes and have them reflect on their performance if it's in phys ed and they're doing layups or they're sending a badminton shuttle. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can do in class. It's anything that you do that captures learning in the moment that then can cause you and your learners to reflect and move forward.
Yeah, I love when you talked about the kinesthetic assessments. Mike Azala has a book called The Kinesthetic Classroom, and in there I stole this from him. It's fantastic. He writes the questions down, and then the answers A, B, C, and D would be a movement. So A might be stand on one leg, B might be jumping jacks, C might be, I don't know, put a leg in front of you, and D might be, do an airplane with the legs behind you, or something similar to that. Whatever you want, it really doesn't matter. And that way, visually, you can pick up on it really quick. Plus, you get the movement aspect in there. So I love anytime you can add movement to the classroom, especially for the health classroom. We do a lot of that. It's fantastic.
And if you have a really safe learning environment, you can also do indicator type formative assessments where, a common one that people talk about are the red, yellow, green cups, or tags where learners can identify when they feel like they're struggling with a red, or when they're not sure they might need help in a little bit with a yellow, or they're doing well with a green. My only caution around those kinds of things, just from working with highly able students and talking to them about this, is you might have a group of students who it means more to them to look like they know all the answers than to be vulnerable and admit that they're struggling. So in those cases, you have to be aware that your learners might not be totally honest with you if there's a social commodity attached to admitting vulnerability.
I like it. Good words of wisdom right there. All right, so let's move on. Are there any other formatives we need to talk about, or should we dive into different types of summative assessments?
Well, because I'm a huge fan of student investment in assessment and learning, I think we have to talk about self-assessment. I think that self-assessment is actually one of the most powerful forms of formative assessment, and one of the ones that we struggle with the most to use with learners. So I think that if you're trying to really empower your kids and have them be part of the learning process, you have to encourage some self-reflection, some goal setting, some action planning pretty consistently in your practice. It can be in the form of a conversation between you and the student. It doesn't have to be a student just sitting at a desk with a rubric and scoring themselves. It can be part of a conversation, but I think it's pretty critical that we start to shift some of the responsibility for learning back to the learners, because that will truly empower them, I think, in the end.
All right, I'll come back to self-assessment in a minute, but that brought me to the idea of peer assessment. What are your thoughts on peer assessments?
Well, I think self and peer assessment have something in common, and that's that they're a complex skill in and of themselves. So for peers to assess each other, or for a student to assess themselves, they have to be skilled at noticing things, remembering what happened, being able to describe them, being able to compare them to criteria or indicators of success, being able to forgive themselves or forgive each other if things don't go so well, so showing empathy. They've got to have stamina to be able to return to something and try again when it hasn't gone well. So those are all kind of sub-skills is what I call them for self-assessment and peer assessment. And I think self and peer assessment can be extremely powerful as long as your learners are really clear about what we're trying to do, what the ultimate goal is, and some of the steps so that they can offer really meaningful feedback. Otherwise, you'll get kids who just tell each other that they're doing good.
Oh, yes, I run up against that all the time. My class, I have a peer assessment set up in the beginning of every class for my older students. So one student's doing exercise, the other student that's their break time. It's 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off. But while they're standing there getting their energy back, they're supposed to be assessing. And I walk around and we talk about giving feedback. And if I hear good job, and then we stop and we say, well, good job doing what? Where's the specifics about it? What are we looking for? Why is it a good job? And we know in general, good job is just such a blah comment that doesn't even mean anything to us anymore. So now when we get the specifics, now I know the person assessing or giving the feedback knows what's going on and knows what to look for, so the knowledge is there, as well as the person who's receiving the feedback knows specifically what they're doing well or what they need to work on.
Yeah, and that makes me think about even when, when I've been a teacher and I've been assessed by my principal, one of the most powerful things when I'm receiving feedback from somebody is not for them to tell me what I did right or wrong, but for them to describe what they saw so that I can reflect on whether that's a good job or not. So that makes me think that maybe one of the skills that we really need to focus on with our learners is being able to describe what they're seeing and describe the criteria for success, and let the actual learner reflect and make some decisions about what they'd like to do.
What are your thoughts on digital portfolios?
I'm a huge fan of them, actually. I really like the idea of learners being in charge of collecting artifacts of their learning. I think it can be very empowering for them, and I think it can be a great celebration of things that they've done. The other thing that I really like about digital portfolios is it allows kids to have a longitudinal look at their performance and growth over time. So often, when we just look at a single test or a single essay or a single video of a performance, we just don't have that sort of depth and breadth of scope to think about how we've grown really deeply. And that's one thing that a digital portfolio does. And of course, the other thing that it does is it allows us to communicate with families, which is really, really critical. It helps families feel pretty confident that their kids are being taken care of, that there's some learning that's happening, and I think it goes a long way to promoting education as a positive.
So this is the point in time where I give my plug for Seesaw, because at some point in every chat I ever have, whether on Twitter or Voxer, I just talk about the power of Seesaw. I mean, it's free, which for me is absolutely fantastic. But I have my students either reflect using the video or the note feature on there. So I'll put out a question, maybe like, what did we learn? Why did we learn? How did we learn it? The quick what, why, how, or something similar. Or maybe I'll have them reflect on Today we worked on passing. What specific thing were you doing to improve your passing ability or whatever it is? So they have the ability to speak, which I think really helps the reflection process, because now you're not worried about typing, you're not worried about writing, you're not worried about spelling. It's just verbalizing it, which I think is easier for a lot of students. And then some students actually like to write, which I was surprised about. They choose the note part on there. So I love Seesaw. I absolutely love it. I think for a digital portfolio, for the reflection piece is fantastic. Then the second part of opening up to the parents and letting the stakeholders see what's going on, that, hey, this is not only what my students doing in class, this is where they're growing. This is where they're learning. This is the point of education. And you get to have a firsthand look at that, which I think is fantastic. Have you come across Seesaw at all, or do you use any other digital portfolios?
Yeah, we use Seesaw here in our division. One of the things that we really like about Seesaw here is, I mean, everywhere, I guess, but from our perspective is that even our youngest learners, our kindergarten and grade 1 students, can do their own uploading. They can manage the app, which is really, really exciting. So that's where we're using it a lot, is in our early years, which might be a little surprising. And then our older learners have done Google Docs. They are big into Google Classroom and those kinds of things, but are also moving into things like Seesaw or different kinds of blog sites. So there's lots of flexibility. One other thing that a lot of our schools are using is Facebook groups, which is kind of an interesting use of Facebook, but we're finding that parents really dig it.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the difference in schools. If your parents are on Facebook or interact through Facebook, then by all means, go meet them where they're at. And if they're on, Twitter or somewhere else, Instagram, somehow meet them where they're at over there, which I love. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Classroom and Seesaw and anything that's going to get our kids reflecting and then able to show what they're doing outside the classroom is a feather in our cap, I believe.
Well, and another thing that's really cool about a digital portfolio is it allows the kids to record things that they do. And I think sometimes we overestimate a human's ability to recall things in detail. So when we're asking them to deeply reflect about a performance or about a work that they've created, it's really tough if they don't have visual evidence of it that they can have a look at again, because memory isn't always accurate. So that's a really powerful piece of a digital tool like Seesaw.
Yeah, and in the visual arts, I mean, when you talk about video reflection and video assessment, taking the video and then coming back and looking at it, you're unable to see yourself when you're moving, when you're doing something. So to have that vantage point, to have the camera on you, and then go back and look at yourself from a different view, now you could really pick up. I could tell a child 20 times about what they're doing, incorrectly or what they should be doing. Now they see it once, and suddenly the light bulb goes off. I've had kids argue with me before. I was doing that. And I don't want to get into an argument with them, but I'm like, why would I tell you were doing something incorrectly if you were doing it properly? Like, I'm not here to put you down. I would tell you if you're doing well. Now suddenly you see it on video, and then the light bulb goes off, and I just think that's a huge, huge piece in the visual arts.
Well, the example that I always give is that I was a volleyball player all the way through high school, and I was often a center blocker. And I used to think that I was jumping like 6 to 8 inches off the ground easy. I was just awesome. I felt like I was soaring. And when I looked at a video of myself, I realized that I was lucky if I had 2 inches. And if anybody had told me differently, I honestly wouldn't have believed them. So video is really critical for good, accurate self-assessment.
Is there anything else we need to know about formative assessment, or any last pieces that you would like to give the audience that they may not know?
The only things I would leave people with is the idea that a formative assessment has to serve a purpose. So if you're going to take the time to collect artifacts or observe or document, make sure you know what you're looking for, be really clear about your targets and your goals so that your time is well spent. And the other thing that I would say around formative assessment is that sometimes it is really nice to get together with colleagues and look at evidence of student learning, whether it be in writing or video clips or audio clips. Look at that together, because we can get really stuck in our classes and in our spaces. And one of the beautiful things about being a teacher is that there are thousands and thousands of other teachers. And doing collaborative, common formative assessment can be a really, really powerful practice for just thinking about our programming, our planning, how we can be responsive and really learning from each other. There are things that we do differently from other people that we assume everyone does that are really powerful, and other people need to know about it, and vice versa.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a big fan of sharing, and then, I call it being a sous chef, taking what other people are doing and putting our twist on it and making it fit the needs of our students. And why should we reinvent the wheel? It's out there, especially if people are going to share it for free.
Well, and the other thing is sometimes it's nice to have a colleague look at some of your student work samples and reassure you that it's not as bad as you think it is, or help you see the light at the end of the tunnel, sort them according to need, and figure out how you're going to address those needs together. Sometimes we just need support when we're struggling, or when our students are struggling with a really difficult concept.
All right, so we're moving on to summative assessments. The things that I would imagine most students dread, because we think summative, we think end of the year exam, end of the marking period exams, end of the semester tests. We think of, at least for me, a lot of bubbles to fill in or a lot of long essays to write. So tell us a little bit about summatives and why they are important.
Well, first of all, I have to remind you that I'm from Canada, and I will admit that in my climate, we don't have standardized tests to the degree that you folks do. So I have a little bit of a different perspective on summative assessments, and I think students have a little bit of a different perspective here than they do in many parts of the United States. The thing about a true summative assessment, aside from a standardized assessment, the true thing about a summative assessment is there is a time when teachers have to use their professional judgment to determine a degree of proficiency of student learning. It's part of our responsibility as professionals. We're extremely capable and knowledgeable and able to do that. And that verification is an essential part of the work that we're doing.
All right. So with that being said, what is the best way, or I guess we start with numerous ways, and then you can tell me what you like the best, or what do you think works best for the student and the teacher when it comes to summatives?
Well, I think when I think about summative assessment, I think a lot of the same things that I said about formative assessment, in that when we design a summative assessment, it really has to be a measure of proficiency in relation to our standards or outcomes or larger learning goals. So sometimes one of the mistakes that teachers make is summatively assessing some of those smaller pieces, those pieces that really belong in the formative realm, attaching a summative score to that. That can be discouraging for kids. It's not really an accurate representation of full and complex understanding. So once we have a really clear understanding of what it is that we're trying to measure, what that looks like, what it sounds like, so that we recognize it, then I think we need the freedom to be able to design a summative assessment experience that reflects that learning goal. It would be wrong to say that there's a single way to do it. I don't think multiple choice is always the best way. Sometimes it can be a great way. It depends on what we're trying to measure. But I think opening up the space to think about summative assessment in a broader sense is a really healthy discussion for us to have. Sometimes a conversation with a student can be just as powerful as anything that they would write down. And so we have to be able to honor all of the different ways that our learners show us what they can do and what they know.
So what are different types of summative assessments that the teachers you work with use?
So it kind of depends on the subject area, to be honest. In physical education, arts education, practical and applied arts, I think with very few exceptions, you would be looking at a performance assessment. So some kind of, I guess the analogy is it's the game, right? It's the time when they put together all of those skills that they've been working on, and they create a painting or a sculpture, or they play in a game, they play a full game of soccer, or they bake that cake, or they sew that outfit. I mean, that's performance. In other subject areas like science and mathematics, I do see a tendency to depend on the written exam most often. So one of the things that we talk about around exams is making sure that you have questions that are inviting deep thinking, that you're not including questions that, again, belong more in the formative realm, and that you're inviting your learners to express their learning in a variety of ways on a single assessment. Another thing that's really critical if you're going to do any kind of assessment is making sure that you are clear about those standards so that you can organize your assessment that way and track learning more clearly. In the traditional way I used to do a summative assessment is I would have my 10 fill in the blanks and then my 5 definitions and then my 10 true false, short answer, long answer. And that's how I organize my assessment. But nowadays, I think it's a lot easier if we organize that assessment by the target or standard that we're trying to measure so that we can record it easily, we can track it easily, and that kind of thing. You also can have summative assessments that invite just straight up observation. I mean, we might be watching, that could be during a performance assessment, it might be a speech, we might be listening and assessing on a rubric. So there's a real variety of ways that we can do it. The critical piece is that the summative assessment really and truly asks your learners to do the very best that they can do, that it accurately and validly measures what they can do, and that you're opening up the space for them to feel comfortable and invested in what you're asking from them.
Yeah, thank God that we have performance pieces, because if I had to hold my kids to a test, that I could see why that would be frustrating for teachers, at least in the performance-based. There's something a little more tangible, a little something that the students can have value in. You know, when you've sewn something, you have a product. When you play a game, you know, there's an enjoyment level there, hopefully, for most people. When you get done writing a test, it's like, all right, thank God I got this done. So now I can move on to the next piece.
Yeah, or even worse, so that now I can move on to the real learning. That's the sad thing about lots of summative assessment is that students see it, instead of seeing it as a celebration of something they've practiced, or instead of investing in it because it's something really authentic and meaningful to them, they see it as another task that they have to complete so that they can get on to the real work and fun of learning. So that's something that I think we could strive to try and correct over time as educators, is try and think of summative ways of measuring learning that do invite greater student investment and that allow kids to celebrate all of those things that they've been practicing so hard.
All right, so to veer a little off course here, where do assessments and grades line up? Are they together? Do they walk hand in hand? Where do you see the two intertwining?
Well, all I can tell you is how we've done it here, and I think it's been extremely useful. I have to start with the standards or targets, because it is from those that we design our assessment experiences. So we're going to design assessments that measure degrees of proficiency in relation to those standards. The grades ultimately should be a way of gathering that assessment information and representing it in a code or a comment, or however each district decides to do that, but in a way that reflects all of the assessment evidence we've gathered. One of the things that is the most difficult for me personally is when I see a grade that doesn't reflect the assessment evidence or the learning of learners. It becomes a magic math kind of calculation, and there's a big strong separation between the two. I really think that the two should inform each other. They really should be derived. You go from the standards to strong assessment practices, strong learning, and then that ultimately, when we're grading students, assigning a grade to something, it is reflective of all the evidence that we've collected.
Do you find that grades put a damper on student learning, or is it a necessary evil? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, on a personal level, I'm pretty torn by grades, actually. I'm not sure exactly what to do with them. I think I've spent about 8 years trying to figure out the best way to do it. Our district in kindergarten to grade 8 doesn't report letters or numbers. We report alpha codes, which represent levels on a proficiency scale, and even that comes with issues, right? As soon as you attach a number or a symbol to anything that a student does, it's a very natural tendency to use that to value our performance solely, to sort of ignore all of the feedback that we're getting and think that it's a really static thing that we have. So I don't know the answer to that. It's funny, I was meeting with new teachers today, and we were playing around with the idea of at least removing all grades from formative assessment, just offering feedback, having one-on-one conferring and that kind of thing. And the new teachers are going to go and give that a try and see if it has an impact on performance. We've had teachers try it in the past and report that they get better learning from learners when they do not put grades anywhere on formative work.
And now that goes into standards-based grading a little bit. And from what I understand, the formatives should not be graded at all, because that's the journey. And really what we want to know is, did they grow? Did they achieve whatever standard that we wanted them to achieve by the end? So it doesn't matter what they did on the quizzes. It doesn't matter what they did on the exit tickets. It doesn't matter anything of the formatives, because all that is the journey leading them from where they are to where we need them to be. And we want to know at the end, did they understand whatever it is that we were teaching them? So there are a lot of teachers over in the United States that are completely getting rid of grades for formatives. All it does is drive instruction for the teacher. Students don't get much feedback in terms of a number or a letter, other than, all right, because this happened, we're going to either teach again and go over a little more in depth, or, hey, you really understood, let's go on to the next thing. And that always made more sense to me than grading homework, than grading a quiz, than grading something in class. It didn't matter. Don't we want to know at the end, did they learn what we wanted them to learn, or do they need to still do things to continue to get there?
Well, that's exactly right. And I think the critical piece about the relationship between formative and summative is, I think we have to stop talking about whether formative counts or whether summative counts. Really, all learning counts. Everything we do, all of the practice, all of the feedback, all of the revisions, all of that is really critical for getting better. And if learners can see the connection between all of that formative practice and feedback and work, that it leads to a stronger summative result, I think that makes sense to them. One of the analogies that I use is, I think of it like an orange. An orange has all of these segments, and those segments are those formative targets that we work on to try and build proficiency. And each one of those segments is really, really important. But we're not going to measure summatively those segments. That's just a piece of an orange. Really, we want kids to be able to put all of those pieces together into a full orange, and that's what a summative assessment would be. So it's not about the little pieces. It's not about valuing all of those little pieces. It's about what they do at the end when they put it together.
That is very, very, very well said.
Thanks. I've been working on that one for a while.
All right. So we have spent almost an hour talking about assessment. Is there anything else under the sun that we need to understand about assessment before we get into where people can reach you, and if they have any questions for you outside of this?
Well, the last thing that I would leave people with is an idea that I've been writing about lately called softening the edges. And really, the crux of that thinking that I've been doing is around the idea that I encourage teachers to listen to their gut. If an assessment practice isn't working, if it's discouraging children, if it's not meeting their need for growth, if it's labeling them, if it's making the teacher feel bad, if it's making the teacher feel like they have too much work and it's too cumbersome, all of those things are indicators that needs aren't being met. And that is what I call a hard edge. It means that we have something in our assessment practice that isn't quite working. And I think lots of times as teachers, we continue to do things because we think we're supposed to. We ignore those signs that something isn't working. So I would just encourage teachers to listen to themselves, to watch their students, and go in with this open heart and this idea that our learners are very, very powerful, and that our relationship with them is powerful. And if something isn't working, figure out a way to fix it or tweak it. Try some things, talk to the students about it, and make assessment a really positive thing that inspires hope instead of something that is discouraging.
Well, Ms. Katie White, you have taken me through the assessment journey. I've learned an absolute ton. Hopefully, people listening will have learned as well. If they have any questions or follow-ups or want to read your blog about softening the edges, where would they find you and your blog?
Well, that's awesome. I just answered that question without pressing record. So you can find me. My email is k.white@sastel.net, and I'm not opposed to answering emails if people have questions. I'm also on Twitter at KatieWhite426, and I'm very open to discussions on there. I host with some partners, I host a Twitter chat on Tuesday nights called #ATSS. I blog for the Assessment Center with Solution Tree, and so you can find lots of my blogs on lots of the things we were talking about. And my ultimate plug is I have a book coming out in February called, if you can believe it, Softening the Edges. So I would love for people to read that and give me feedback on that book as well.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and effort, and hopefully I will be able to chime in on the Twitter, and when the book comes out, hit me up. That is something that would be cool. It'd be cool to do a little Voxer book study on it. So I appreciate your time and effort, and thank you very, very much for coming on to the BlabberMouths of Voxcast.
It was honest to goodness a pleasure, Justin. Thanks a lot for asking me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of the Global Phys Ed Voxcast. I'd like to say thank you to Justin Schleider and Katie White for coming on the show and sharing their knowledge of assessment with us. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please check out physedagogy.com/Voxcast, where you will find a link to join the Voxer chat. So each week we talk about the previous week's podcast. So next week we'll be talking about this podcast and about assessment and how we include it in our classrooms. So check that out if you want to be part of the conversation. As always, this show is brought to you by Sport Time featuring Spark. Make sure you check out sparkpe.org for more information on them. And thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again next week.